Hey there, everyone. This is Gregg Schutze for Ready for the Draft.com, and this is the Ready for the Draft podcast, episode 12 of the series dedicated to the draft-eligible prospects for the 2020 NFL Draft, which is set to begin in April in Las Vegas, Nevada. College football playoff rankings have been announced for Week 11. Ohio State up at the top. I don't think anybody is really arguing that. They've looked like the most complete team defensively, led by Chase Young, who could very well be the number one overall pick. Jeffrey Okudah, who is likely the number one cornerback that's going to be taken in the draft as well. Offensively, you have one of the emerging running backs in J.K. Dobbins, a guy who's going to be, he is the first Ohio State Buckeye since Archie Griffin, 3 straight seasons over 1,000 yards. LSU sitting there at number 2. Obviously, Joe Burrow, what he's been able to do in Joe Brady's offense. He's gone from a mid to late round pick at best to a guy that we're talking about in the top 15 picks. Joe Brady brought that offense from New Orleans to LSU. And I'll tell you what, you can definitely see Joe Brady and envision Joe Brady in an offense there at the next level. With the way that he's been able to run that offense. But look, Clyde Edwards-Helaire running the football, short, compact frame, and a guy who I think has really good vision, underrated acceleration and speed. He's the guy that people are looking past. LSU is going to be taking on the number 3 ranked Alabama Crimson Tide. And I'll tell you what, I think Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going to be a guy that everyone's going to be talking about when that game is over. Justin Jefferson made his way into the top 10 for receivers. Only a junior, but I anticipate he'll come out into the draft. He'll be a guy that's going to try to push for first round consideration, likely a day 2 pick. And then that defense. Grant Delpit, the number 1 safety. Jacob Phillips, one of the better interior linebackers, inside linebackers. It's going to really be interesting, with Christian Fulton on the outside. He'll get to go one-on-one with Jerry Jeudy, Devontae Smith, Henry Ruggs. Because, yes, Alabama is ranked number 3, sitting there at 8-0. You can argue that LSU's schedule has been better than Alabama's, and that's why they're sitting there ahead of them. But I'll tell you what, Coach O won't have them looking past Bama at all, because that offense obviously led by Tua Tagovailoa, who I think is the top quarterback right now in this draft. You have all of the receivers. They have 2 tackles who we'll be talking about here in a minute in Alex Leatherwood and Jedrick Wills, who are likely first or second round picks. You have a running back in Najee Harris, who's a big physical guy between the tackles. Lacks a burst, but definitely physical. And then defensively, a lot of young guys on that defense, but they're led by the likes of Anthony Jennings at outside linebacker, Raekwon Davis there at defensive end, Trevin Diggs at corner, Xavier McKinney at safety. All of those guys have a chance to be first rounders or really top 40 picks when it's all said and done. And then you're sitting there looking at Penn State at number 4. So you have 2 Big Ten teams and 2 SEC teams. Penn State, obviously, that defense is ferocious. Robert Windsor at defensive tackle, nobody's really talking about him. Nobody's really talking about Shaka Toney there at defensive end. But who they are talking about, and for good reason, is Yetur Gross-Matos, a guy who I think could very well be a first-round defensive end. He wreaks havoc in opposing backfields. I want to see him really get home against the quarterback. Haven't really gotten to see a ton of that this year, but definitely a guy who can be a force up front. KJ Hamler on offense, the receiver. He has a good chance of being a day 2 pick when it's all said and done, be a slot receiver. There's so much depth to this wide receiver position in the 2020 draft. He could very well fall to day 3, which means he's likely going to come back for one more year there with the Nittany Lions. Outside the top 4, Clemson Tigers, they're sitting there at 9-0. Trevor Lawrence, we know we're going to be talking about him next season, but Travis Etienne, only 9 carries to get him over 200 yards a week ago against Wofford. This is a guy who is a special back in terms of the speed. Can take take the top off of a defense at any given point, has a threat to go the distance, improved pass catcher, improved pass blocker as well. I think he's really improving his draft stock after Clemson. Well, obviously, before we talk about the Georgia Bulldogs, who are sitting there at number 6, Clemson, Isaiah Simmons, that outside linebacker. He should be a top 10, top 12 pick, in my opinion. He's the new age outside linebacker, a guy who has the range to play the run, has the ability to drop back and into coverage, can blitz the quarterback as well. Excellent athlete. A.J. Terrell there at corner is going to be a guy that is going to garner some consideration into day 2. Georgia Bulldogs led by Jake Fromm. And look, you can say what you want. Obviously, Tua and Justin Herbert and Joe Burrow are going to be the top 3 quarterbacks. But what Jake Fromm does, he may not have the fancy arm or anything like that, but you'd have to talk about the intangibles. This is a guy who's been a 3-year starter there for the Bulldogs, and the pre-snap reads, what he does with that offense, putting them in the right position, taking what the defense gives him, audibling when he needs to. This is a guy who just has full command of that offense. And to me, I think that's something, there's a lot to be said there. You see what Gardner Minshew and Daniel Jones, to a lesser extent, that experience gets you out on the football field a lot quicker there in the NFL. DeAndre Swift, one of the better running backs, excellent hands out of the backfield, a guy who has a nice burst in the open field as well, can run the ball a little bit between the tackles. Andrew Thomas, who we're going to be talking about here in just a moment, is a potential top 10 pick at left tackle. If we're talking about offensive linemen, though, looking at number 7, Oregon Ducks, Penei Sewell, he'll be the first tackle taken in the 2021 draft. Let's just get that straight right now. But Justin Herbert, the quarterback, he's a guy that people are kind of mixed emotions on. This is a kid with a big arm, reminds you a lot of Josh Allen with the athleticism and the size. But is he a leader? Does he make the right decision? There are some concerns there for him. But Oregon with that offensive line, Shane Lemieux, Calvin Throckmorton, Jake Hansen, may not be the most athletically gifted guys, but guys who I think are going to make an NFL roster and end up starting in the league for quite a while. Utah, sitting there at number 8, 8-1 on the year, and the Utes in the driver's seat now with USC losing to Oregon a week ago for the Pac-12 South. When you look at them, they're ferocious up front defensively. Leki Fotu, Bradley Anai, Francis Bernard, who's an underrated inside linebacker. You have Jalen Johnson at corner, Julian Blackman at safety, and then obviously offensively, you have the bell cow, Zach Moss. If he can stay healthy, Zach Moss could very well be, in consideration for top 40, top 50. But, all the injuries, that's going to be a red flag. The medicals have to check out for him, but he should be a day 2 pick. Oklahoma, kind of on the outside looking in a little bit after their loss to Kansas State. Coming off a bye, they'll be playing Iowa State this weekend. The number 9th ranked Sooners have arguably the best inside linebacker in Kenneth Murray. The speed, the size. He still has some problems with gap discipline, gets himself out of position a little bit, but he's a guy who is going to be in consideration as a first-round pick, probably a late first-rounder. Obviously, C.D. Lamb, and a guy who really looked a lot like Julio Jones against Texas with the physicality and the speed. He's somebody who I think could potentially sneak his way into the top 10, but he'll probably end up being probably 12 or 13 pick in the draft come April. OU also, you have Jalen Hurts, the grad transfer from Alabama. Jalen Hurts is a guy who at the quarterback position, after the top 4, you have a lot of juniors who have a decision to make. They could all end up coming back, which will leave Jalen Hurts as one of those guys that could potentially sneak his way into day 2 consideration. This was a guy everyone was talking about, really more so as an athlete than anything else. He's shown that he can run an offense, that he's picked it up pretty quickly, and he's just going to continue to develop. I remember Dak Prescott as a junior, really was an athlete playing quarterback. senior year there at Mississippi State, really became a quarterback who just happened to be a good athlete. Jalen Hurts isn't quite there yet, but that jump that he's been able to make from Alabama to OU, it'll be interesting to see what he can do at the next level as a developmental prospect. And then Florida, at number 10, rounding out the top 10, the 7-2 Gators. LaMichael Pirine running the football. Here's a guy running behind a really inexperienced offensive line, but still finding a way to get yards after contact, really using that leg drive and showing a pretty good burst, vision to find the holes where, really he's just looking for a crease. Van Jefferson, one of the most underrated receivers there for Kyle Trask, who's filling in for the injured Felipe Franks at quarterback. Defensively, obviously Jabari Zuniga and Jonathan Greenard, they're up front. If they can stay healthy, that's going to go a long way for Florida defensively. You have C.J. Henderson, who's one of the better corners in the league. The problem is he has to be consistent, has to also be able to show that he can tackle. I know a lot of these corners can be shut down corners, but are they going to be physical? Are they going to be able to tackle? That's really what sets you apart from some of these other guys. He could still end up being a first-round pick, but it's one of those things to where I've seen him get beat. He's been getting beat in recent weeks, and if he doesn't like the physical play, then I think that's going to end up hurting your draft stock, especially when you have guys like Okudah, Paulson Adebo. We talked about Trevin Diggs. Those are guys that aren't afraid to get themselves dirty, and do the dirty work. So C.J. Henderson's going to have to show that he's able to do that. So those are the top 10. Just going through it really quickly with the college football rankings, and a lot really left, obviously, to be determined. We've got 5 of those rankings to come out. So this one's probably the one that means the least, because the one that means the most, obviously, is the one at the very end. And this is one really kind of starting things out. It'll be interesting to look back on it and say, what were those initial rankings? Because we know a lot's going to change, especially after this weekend. LSU, Alabama, Penn State playing Minnesota. Georgia's going to be playing one of the SEC, SEC West champions in the SEC championship. Oregon's going to be playing Utah more than likely. OU is going to get another crack potentially at Baylor or Kansas State. They're in a Big 12 championship. So there's going to be a lot left to play for. I'm looking forward to the end of the season. I think it's really going to shape up to be, you really don't know which way this is going to go right now. And I think that's what makes it so much fun. So what are we going to do this week? We're going to go ahead and take a look at the tight ends and the offensive line. In past weeks, we've talked about the quarterbacks. As I mentioned earlier, Tua, Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert really setting themselves apart from everyone else. Then there's Jake Fromm, Jordan Love, Jacob Eason, Jamie Newman. There's another name to remember. And he's a guy who, you look at Jacob Eason, inconsistent play. He was under pressure quite a bit against Utah. And, when he had time in the pocket, he was picking the Utes apart. But when he was under pressure, that's when you really saw a lot of errant throws. Jordan Love, struggling to see the entire field. He's kind of a different quarterback, struggling in the first year under Gary Anderson in his second stint there at Utah State. Really thrived under Matt Wells, who's taken off for Texas Tech. So Jordan Love, does he come back to Utah State? Does he look to be a grad transfer and move on to somewhere else? It's going to be interesting to see what happens there. Sam Ehlinger at Texas, another junior who I think is having a breakout year of sorts, really emerging as a quarterback to be reckoned with. And then, like I said, Jamie Newman, 6'4", 230 pounds, the junior, excellent arm, accuracy, is in the high 60s. And, he also has those weapons, Sage Surratt, Scotty Washington. If you haven't gotten to watch the Demon Deacons play, you're in for a treat. You got to tune in and watch them play. Dave Clawson really has something going there. I hope Jamie Newman comes back for one more year. But depending on what happens with some of these other juniors, it'd be interesting to see what would happen. If he were to come out, he could potentially be that fifth quarterback. Running backs, Jonathan Taylor, DeAndre Swift, Travis Etienne, J.K. Dobbins. Now Chuba Hubbard has really emerged as that sprinter speed, over 1,400 yards now. And I think Chuba Hubbard has really really put himself into that consideration as a top 5 running back. It's not really a talk about just 4 running backs anymore. He's emerged and put himself into the top 5. Wide receivers, Jerry Jeudy, CeeDee Lamb, Henry Ruggs, T. Higgins, Laviska Shenault in the top 5. But look, Michael Pittman Jr., what he's been able to do there at USC, teams are double and triple covering him. They're really changing their offense, and gearing it around stopping Pittman. That's why if you watch USC play, Tyler Vaughn, Amon-Ra St. Brown, they're getting a lot of the balls, as is Drake London, the talented freshman who's also on the basketball team. But Michael Pittman Jr. he's that special. He's a guy that teams are having to game plan around him specifically. They don't want him to beat you. And when you're talking about that, when you have defenses that are game planning to shut you down, you got something there. So, we're going to go ahead and talk about the tight ends now. And at the top of my list is Brycen Hopkins out of Purdue, 6'5", 245 pounds. Really started emerging a season ago. I had 34 receptions for 583 yards and 2 touchdowns. But this year, man, he's already surpassed his receptions with 42, over 500 yards again, 3 touchdowns. But he's not only a downfield threat, he's a guy who can go, he's a weapon over the middle. He's been a guy in the red zone that they're looking to, and Purdue's had quite a few quarterbacks get injured, from Elijah Sindelar all the way through, Plummer, this past week, I believe. He also got injured. So they're struggling there at the quarterback position, but he's been the go-to target. He's been the reliable guy, but he's also an excellent inline blocker. He's probably the most complete of all of the tight ends in this year's draft. He's sitting there at my number 1. Cole Kmet out of Notre Dame, the 6'5", 250-pound junior, is sitting there at number 2. And here's the thing with Cole Kmet. He's another really good inline blocker. You watch him play there on the outside. Does a really good job setting the edge in the running game as well. 27 receptions, 318 yards, 5 touchdowns through just 6 games. He's been battling some of the injuries, but when he's healthy, he's absolutely a threat in the passing game. Excellent hands, attacks the ball in the air, and is a threat to run after the catch. Cole Kmet, a guy, I look at he and Hopkins, and they're definitely guys that are going to be in the top 40, top 50 consideration. I have Albert Ogwuegbunam from Missouri, 6'5", 255-pound redshirt junior. Now look, Ogwuegbunam is probably the fastest of the tight ends. He's probably going to run in the 4.5 range, and if he does that, you're talking about a guy who's not going to get out of the second round. You're talking about speed. You're talking about a guy who can be a weapon. The biggest issue for him is staying healthy. He's been battling injuries the last 2 seasons, and through missing parts of games and out other games, and really has been that weapon for Drew Lock a season ago and Kelly Bryant this year. He needs to really prove that he can stay healthy, and that's ultimately what I think is going to hinder his draft stock a little bit. He's not the best blocker of the bunch right now, but he's only played 9 games as a freshman, 9 games as a sophomore, and just 7 games so far as a junior. So he's someone who, yes, 23 touchdowns in his career, including 11 as a freshman, but if you can't stay healthy and can't stay out on the football field, then that's going to be a problem for sure. Jared Pinkney from Vanderbilt, 6'4", 255 pounds. He has a chance to move ahead of Ogwuegbunam, but because of the fact that he is a little bit more polished as a blocker. But the thing with it is Jared Pinkney. Vanderbilt, we were expecting with Pinkney at tight end and Kalijah Lipscomb at wide receiver and Keyshawn Vaughn at running back, that Vanderbilt was really going to take off, especially with Riley Neal coming in as a grad transfer from Ball State. Just hasn't happened. And you look at Pinkney, just 15 receptions on the year for 157 yards. Now, they've struggled a bit on offense, and that has something to do with it for sure. Last year with Kyle Shermer, a quarterback, 50 catches, over 700 yards, 7 touchdowns, 15.5 yards per reception, showing that he can be a downfield threat, really a threat up the seam. Excellent over the middle as well. Pretty good route runner, 6'4", 260 pounds. I think he can end up being the number 3 tight end, but I just don't see him yet on the level of Brycen Hopkins and Cole Kmet. Outside of those top 4, Hunter Bryant out of Washington, I've got him sitting there at number 5. He's 6'2", 237-pound junior. You hear that 6'2", 237, you're thinking that he's a bigger wide receiver, and you wouldn't be wrong there. I think you look at Hunter Bryant, and he does look like a big receiver. He's out there in the slot, out on the outside. But if you watched him against Utah, going against Julian Blackmon, really just ate him alive. Ran a double move on really a slot fade and wound up catching the ball over his shoulder, tracked the ball really well, looked like a receiver on the play. And I think he's still developing as a blocker for sure, but 36 catches, 557 yards, 3 touchdowns on the year. He looks like that big wideout. And I think for that, he's been one of the favorite targets of Jacob Eason. And so that's something that he has going for him. When you talk about Evan Ingram from a couple seasons ago, the 2017 draft, he's 6'3", 227 pounds, was a downfield threat for sure for Ole Miss. 65 catches, 926 yards, and 8 touchdowns in his senior season. Those were stats that ultimately got him drafted 23 overall by the Giants in that first round. But similar build, similar body type. So when you're talking about the type of player that Hunter Bryant is, that's the first name that comes to mind. Evan Ingram. He's going to be one of those guys that's going to be split out and will have to develop as a blocker. I look at Grant Calcaterra of Oklahoma, 6'4", 240 pounds, the junior from Southern California. He reminds me of another Mark Andrews. The problem with Grant Calcaterra, I think he's probably going to come back to Norman for one more season to play with the Sooners. And the reason being is he's been struggling with injuries. And, he's questionable with an upper body injury, missed the last 3 games. Not really sure if he's going to be playing against Iowa State right now. Played in only 5 games as a freshman. Struggled with some injuries a season ago. Only played in 3 games this year. So he's going to have to prove that he can stay healthy throughout an entire season. So I anticipate him coming back to Norman. But I have him penciled in as my number 6 wideout, number 6 tight end, because frankly, he reminds me a lot of Mark Andrews, and you see the success that he's had with the Baltimore Ravens to this point. Sitting at number 7 is Colby Parkinson out of Stanford, 6'7", 240-pound junior. And Colby Parkinson, he has tremendous size, making him a red zone threat. He's been somebody that whoever's playing quarterback for Stanford, he's been that go-to target, a guy that they really want to get the ball to. I think he emerged a season ago, 7 touchdowns last year, 16.7 yards per reception. Really a good route runner for a guy his size. And look, Stanford tight ends all know how to block, especially in that power running game. But, I think he's someone who's continuing to develop, and, I think he's a guy who would probably be a early day 3 pick, but a guy who I think will stick on rosters. You look at Stanford tight ends, Levine Toilolo is still sitting on a roster. He is a bigger, I think Parkinson's a more athletic version of a guy like Toilolo. Toilolo, also 6'7". Parkinson, I think, better receiver, better athlete. So be interesting to see where Parkinson goes, but I think he could end up being an early day 3 pick. Now, Adam Troutman out of Dayton, 6'6", 250 pounds, and I'll tell you what, he's a tremendous receiver. He's a guy that people aren't really talking about, and I want to get more game film on him. But I look at the stats, and I've gotten to watch some of the highlights, and this is a big guy who has tremendous hands, a downfield threat, a guy who's going to be a weapon up the seam, and he just makes plays. And you look at his stat lines, and 160 catches in his career for over 2,000 yards and 28 touchdowns, including 11 this season to this point. 52 catches this year for over 688 yards. And 20 touchdowns in the last 2 seasons combined. He's a guy that you really want to keep an eye out for, and I'll be looking forward to seeing him at the combine, see how he runs. He could be a guy that could be rising up draft boards. And look, I've got a couple of juniors that are sitting there ahead of him. There's a good chance that Adam Troutman's just going to continue to move up draft boards. Jacob Breland out of Oregon, 6'4", 250 pounds. He's among the leaders at the tight end position until he tore his ACL and was out for the year. Jacob Breland, look, he's got the speed. I thought he was a decent blocker as well, but that speed, his ability to separate, especially from defensive backs, made him a special player for the Oregon Ducks. I just worry about that knee now and where he's at, where he's going to be. He won't be able to participate at the combine, so teams will kind of have to really gauge that knee, make sure that he's going to be able to make a full recovery, but I think that's going to impact his draft stock. If he had a chance at day 2, I think that's pretty much gone at this point. I think he could probably still be a 4th or 5th round pick. But it'll remain to be seen, where he's going to end up. A lot of it's going to be determined by those medicals. Harrison Bryant, virtually, a guy that people aren't really talking about out of Florida Atlantic, 6'7", 240 pounds. And look, we were talking about Hunter Bryant, and I think he's the receiver version of, at the tight end position, and Harrison Bryant is a big physical tight end. Back-to-back seasons with over 600 yards, and 44 receptions at least in each of the seasons as well. Big physical guy, still developing as a blocker, but a guy who I think could end up being a number 2 tight end for a team at the next level. And then rounding things out, Matt Bushman out of BYU, 6'5", 245 pounds. He's been the go-to guy there for the BYU Cougars, and actually the last couple of seasons. And he's a weapon. Just 28 receptions so far this year, 398 yards, and 3 touchdowns. But he's a guy. They just need to continue to get the ball to Bushman, because he's a matchup nightmare. He's faster than the linebackers, bigger than the safeties, and a guy who is a weapon up the seam. So I'm waiting to see if what's going to happen there with Bushman. He's only a junior, so he could come back for one more year. And frankly, I think it would probably behoove him to come back to Provo for one more year and really work on that draft stock a little bit more. So that's my look at the tight end position. Really, I don't know that there's a first rounder in this group. I think you're probably talking about a few day 2 prospects there in your first. I'd say probably about 4 tight ends. Maybe Hunter Bryant could sneak in there depending on what his 40 time would be if he decides to come out. But the junior class with the tight ends would really be adding some depth to this position. So let's move into the trenches and talk about the offensive line. Offensive tackle position specifically, we'll jump in there first. And when you're talking about the offensive tackles, I think the last few years we've looked at the tackle position and not a position with a ton of depth. And I think that's going to change this year. We're going to see quite a few offensive tackles taken in the early rounds of this draft. If you were to look at last season, the 2019 draft, you did have 4 offensive tackles taken in round number 1 with Jonah Williams, Andre Dillard, Titus Howard, and Caleb McGarry all going in round number 1. And that was really the first time that we had seen four offensive tackles taken in round number 1 since 2016. That was a year with Ronnie Stanley, Jack Conklin, Laramie Tunsil, and Taylor Decker, all taken in the top 16 picks of that draft. But the last couple of drafts, we had Mike McGlinchey and Colton Miller, the only two offensive tackles taken in round number 1 in 2018. 2017, we also saw Garrett Bowles, Ryan Ramczyk. That was a draft that really, you look at some of the names there with that draft. Cam Robinson, has gotten to start for the Jaguars. Sam Tevy started for the Chargers. He was taken in round number 6, but not a whole lot of depth there to that offensive tackle group. And it really showed because only 15 offensive tackles were taken in that draft. As you compare that to this past season's draft, we actually had 23 tackles. When you look at that draft, not only did you have those guys in the first round, you had Jawan Taylor, Greg Little, Cody Ford, Dalton Reisner, Max Sharping playing guard for the Texans and starting, Chuma Edoga starting at left tackle for the Jets. He was taken in round number 3. Bobby Evans, David Edwards, Justin School getting some starting time there for the San Francisco 49ers. He was taken in round number 6. So yeah, there was some depth, obviously, at that offensive tackle position in last year's draft. A lot of guys taken in the first 3 rounds. So I think that's really one of the things when we're talking about this draft class. I think we have 4 or 5 guys at the top that we're really going to be looking at. And depending on what happens with a few of the juniors, we could have even more depth to it. There's some injuries that this draft class really was hit with. Walker Little of Stanford, who was really expected to be one of the top 2 or 3 tackles in this year's draft. He went out for the year. And so that kind of hurt things a little bit at the tackle position. And Alaric Jackson, a guy for Iowa, he's come back, but he really hasn't looked the same. And that's one of the things that I look at. He may still enter the draft, but I would argue that it would be better for him to come back for one more season there in Iowa City with the Hawkeyes and play out that senior season, really improve that draft stock a little bit, because he looked to be a little step slow coming back, and has been beaten repeatedly on the outside. So I'd love to see him come back for one more year. But when you're talking about the top of this draft, there are 4 juniors in my top 5. And number 1 on my list right now is Tristan Wirfs out of Iowa. 6'5", 322-pound junior, 3-year starter there for Iowa, playing there on the right side, but filled in for Alaric Jackson at left tackle. Showed better footwork than I was expecting there at the left tackle position. Nice short, choppy steps. Struggled a little bit with speed. Coming off the edge, but I thought he filled in admirably. You can really tell that right tackle is more of his comfort zone. Really good athleticism, able to mirror defenders, but the power, that's really what you see with him. Brandon Sheriff was a guy that I really wanted to watch there at Iowa. And, when you're talking about Brandon Sheriff, I think everyone remembers the hang clean. And he was a guy that really kind of set everything on, by storm. He set YouTube and everybody really talking about, hey, Brandon Sheriff out of Iowa, look at that hang clean. And that's one of the things that Iowa released before the season began. Everyone talking about it, hang cleaning. I believe it was 480 pounds. Actually in Iowa, it was up to 410 pounds. I think he's hang cleaning 480 now there at Washington. But Tristan Wirfs posted his own video there on YouTube with his own hang clean, and he was able to put up 3 reps at 450 pounds. Made it look easy. So the power there out of a guy like Tristan Wirfs, you see that he's very heavy-handed. But one of the things that I'd like to see him do a little bit more, that one of the things that Brandon Sheriff really did well was sustaining his blocks. Once he locked on, he wasn't letting go, and I think that's one of the things that you don't always see out of Tristan Wirfs in the running game, especially when he climbs to the second level. Sustain that block, really finish it, play it all the way to the whistle, And, that's what I think he's lacking a little bit in his game. Now, Andrew Thomas out of Georgia, 6'5", 320-pound junior. I think he and Wirfs are going to battle it out to be the top tackle taken. And I have a good feeling that these two guys will both end up being taken in the top 10. Why? There are guys, there are teams sitting there in the top 10 who have their quarterback. Hello, Cleveland Browns. Hello, New York Jets. Those are two teams that absolutely need offensive tackle help. They just do. And these are two guys that could absolutely do that. Washington's another one. What's going to happen with Trent Williams? He's likely not going to be back there for the Redskins, so that's also an option. But if I'm them, and Chase Young is still on the board, then I'm absolutely taking Chase Young. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. But Andrew Thomas, I don't think he has ideal length. Despite the fact that he's 6'5", arm length doesn't look to be ideal. But look, Isaiah Wynn proved that you don't need to have the long arms to succeed there at the tackle position, and ultimately got himself drafted in round number 1. Shouldn't worry about that. Look, Joe Thomas is a Hall of Famer, and he's got shorter arms. So I think we can kind of put that argument to bed. But he's still... he plays with good leverage. He's a natural knee bender, a guy who does extend those arms underneath the pad level of the defensive end, does a good job standing him up, and gets a good push, good leg drive. Want to see a little bit more power out of him, but at the same time, he and Solomon Kinley will really cave in that left side there for the Bulldogs. Alex Leatherwood sitting there at number 3, 6'6", 310-pound junior out of Alabama. He's the first of the two Bama offensive tackles that we're going to be talking about. And Alex Leatherwood, he started last year at guard. If you'll remember, Jonah Williams was the left tackle, and there was talk who's going to be playing left tackle for Bama. You've got Jedrick Wills sitting there at right tackle. Matt Womack, who was going to play left tackle, is Leatherwood going to stay at guard? I actually had him penciled in my initial rankings as a guard because you really didn't know what to expect. And really you were thinking, all right, if he's not going to play inside, maybe he'll, the ceiling is going to be at right tackle. But I'll tell you what, he's absolutely a left tackle at the next level. A guy who very nimble with his feet, and you can see that, his ability to pop out of his stance, uses his long arms to his advantage, active hands, and a guy who is just an easy mover. And I was surprised to see him move as well as he does. And then you see that power in the running game that he's really developed as a guard, and he's really taken that to the offensive tackle position. So that versatility, I think he and Tristan Wirfs have some versatility on some of these other guys at the offensive tackle position. So I think he'll probably be a top 15, top 16 pick. If the Chargers don't end up, who knows where the Chargers are going to be, if they're going to be a top 10 pick or not. But, I think if they're looking for a tackle position and Thomas and Wirfs are off the board, then Alex Leatherwood would absolutely be a guy that they're looking at. Trey Adams out of Washington, 6'8", 314 pounds. Look, after this guy's sophomore year, everyone was talking about him as potentially being the number 1 overall pick. And then a torn ACL, back injury a season ago, really hit his draft stock in a major way. We're talking about major red flags, durability concerns. Is he going to hold up over a 16-game season? Big concern, right? Last season, after he came back from the back injury, really looked a step slow. Struggling with guys coming off the edge. What's going to happen with Trey Adams? Well, this year, he's really redeemed himself. He stayed healthy, and he's been the anchor for the Washington Huskies there at the left tackle position. The knee bend, he's one of the better, in terms of flexibility, one of the better offensive tackles in this draft. The knee bend is absolutely there. He pops out of his stance, and for a guy who's 6'8", he has pretty good flexibility. really heavy-handed, really going to look to strike strike his guy and really throw him off of his route to the quarterback. That arc that they're running, that punch is going to jolt them and really stun them. Really effortless with his power step back to the inside on secondary moves. One of the things that I thought was interesting, though, if you watch the game against Utah, his kick slide is really quite shallow. And I think some of the other guys that we've already talked about with Wirfs, Thomas, Leatherwood, I like the angle to their kick slide. They're beating guys to the edge, and yet they still have the athleticism and the lateral agility to be able to counter those secondary moves, be able to, plant that left foot and explode back with a power step back to the inside to pick up that inside secondary rush. Now, Trey Adams, what he does have, he has those powerful hands and does a really good job. He has pretty quick feet for a guy his size. So even though a guy might get to that outside shoulder with that narrow kick slide, the shallow kick slide, not getting a ton of depth, he's really, almost stepping, not quite parallel, but it's not at the depth that you'd like to see where he's beating guys to the edge. I think Bradlee Anae was beating him to the edge at times, but because he had some recovery speed and his ability, he never panicked, got the hands in, would push the guy, push Bradlee Anae up the field and away from the pocket, away from Jacob Eason. But the problem was he kind of weared down a little bit there in the fourth quarter. If you watch that game, the foot speed after Bradlee Anae was getting to that outside shoulder just wasn't there. And Bradlee Anae eventually got to the quarterback, was able to attack that outside shoulder, and he had that shallow kick slide, didn't get any depth to it. And, it's one of those things I would have liked to have seen him, okay, if you don't have the foot speed, if you're lacking some of that conditioning or lacking, the ability to get out there and explode out of your stance, then at least take an angle that's going to make things a little bit tougher for Bradlee Anae to get to the edge. And really, once he got there, got to the outside, there really wasn't a whole lot that Trey Adams was able to do. So I think that's really the biggest thing that I saw out of him. But in the running game, he's absolutely physical. He's got that punch. I think he's somebody who's going to be a first-round pick, and I'd really want to see how the medicals test, and really how he tests at the combine as well, because I think the first three have kind of separated themselves as top 15, top 20 picks, and Trey Adams is probably a mid to late first rounder right now just because of the injuries. But if he can prove that he's healthy, I think there's a good chance that you could see Trey Adams continue to move up draft boards. Speaking of guys who's moving up draft boards, we're going to stay in the Pac-12 and talk about a guy from USC and Austin Jackson. 6'6", 310-pound junior. If you saw at the beginning of the season, he was donated his kidney to his sister. Really a great story. But look, the athleticism out of Austin Jackson is absolutely there. If you tuned in and watched the game against Oregon, he was really having his way on the outside. The athleticism to easily mirror guys on the outside. Has really long arms, quick out of his stance, really light on his feet. I thought that he did a good job anchoring well on the edge. Let's see, good angle on his kick slide, excellent hand placement. Looking at my notes throughout that game, decent punch with his hands. Let's see. Really did a good job keeping the freshman phenom, Kayvon Thibodeau, in front of him. A lot of times Thibodeau would beat him with speed, but he was able to still push him up the field and away from the quarterback. Didn't really panic, was able to still do that. Didn't need to hold him. Did a really good job too with those strike. The strike with his hands, that punch throwing Thibodeau off and really, stifling that run to some degree. And I look at Austin Jackson, that athleticism is really something that teams are going to be looking for out of a left tackle. And I look at him, the polish that you see from him, he doesn't give up very many quarterback hurries. So I think he's someone who's going to continue to rise up draft boards. So number 6 on my list is a guy out of UConn, Matt Peart, at 6'7", 302 pounds, from Kingston, Jamaica. And when you watch him, he's really light on his feet in pass protection, but the knee bend, it's incredible. You can see the basketball background because he gets so low in pass pro. So he takes those hands, and it's really hard to out leverage this guy because the hands, he's got long arms, and he just extends them right into that chest plate of the defensive end and just stands the guy up, and really able then at that point to really mirror the guy wherever he's going. And, phenomenal knee bend, and that athleticism really, he uses that to his advantage. He's able to climb to the second level in the run game. What's crazy is I'm reading my notes in the game against Houston, and the defensive end, trying to rip under him, but really used his hands, kept those hands inside, locked on, and that the defensive end really was having a hard time when he was trying to rip through. He just wasn't letting go. Very easy mover laterally. The kick slide was really quick. No need to really open up, because he was beating the guy to the edge, and then after that, he was able to control his man. Still a little raw, still a developmental guy, especially in the run game, but the athleticism is absolutely there, and he's kind of like, that clay that you can just mold into a top tackle. And I know that there's going to be an offensive line coach that's just looking at this kid saying, can we get him somewhere on day 2? Don't wait until day 3, because he's not going to be there. Jedrick Wills, out of Alabama, the junior, 6'5", 320 pounds. Look, I wasn't jumping on the Jedrick Wills train to begin with. A lot of people were talking about him, and I was thinking, all right, this guy, he's got power, but is he really that athletic? And the answer is yes. This is a guy who moves really well for a right tackle, and the power, though, and that's something that you're really looking for out of that right tackle. He's somebody that Bama can run behind, and he's going to use his hands. He's going to strike you. He's going to try to look to maul you a little bit, and that leg drive to really drive his man down the field. I think Jedrick Wills, he has a chance to come back for one more year, potentially even move over to the left tackle position where he could, if Leatherwood decides to come out, and potentially show off some of that athleticism. But, he right now I have him slated as my number 7 tackle. There's still a chance that he could end up vaulting some of these other guys and end up as a late first round pick. But, look, we talked about Jawan Taylor as a potential first rounder. There were some people that even had him in the top 10 at one point. He ended up coming off the board number 35 overall. Greg Little, another guy that we were talking about, he actually played on the left side. He went 37 overall. Cody Ford, a right tackle, he went number 38. Dalton Reisner, a right tackle, also went in round number 2, and he was the guy that we were talking about at one point going in round number 1. So Jedrick Wills, to me, is the guy that's probably going to end up being a day 2 pick right now, just looking at the landscape. So there's a good chance that he may decide to come back for one more year with the Crimson Tide. Speaking of tackles that are likely going to be a day 2 pick, Calvin Throckmorton out of Oregon. This guy played 4 positions: left tackle, right tackle. I believe it was right guard and center when Jake Hansen went down. Looked a little, like a fish out of water there at the center position. But at right tackle, that's really his home. And you see some pretty decent athleticism. He was pulling. He was a lead blocker for C.J. Verdell. There were a couple of other wide receiver screens, and he was one of those guys getting 10, 15 yards down the field to make some blocks. 6'5", 309. He's a veteran offensive tackle. Look, people were doubting Max Sharping And I was telling everyone this is going to be a guy who's going to start sooner rather than later. We saw that with the Houston Texans. He was getting in there, starting, playing well, and I think Calvin Throckmorton is one of those guys who could potentially do the same. Prince Tega Wanogo out of Auburn, 6'7", 305 pounds. Now, look, this is a guy who I think everybody saw the athleticism, talked about him being a raw developmental guy, and I think he's still developing, but he's really, turned himself and transformed himself into a guy that we're not really talking about as much as a raw prospect as we are a legitimate left tackle at the next level. I don't think he's ready just yet to step into a starting role, but keep an eye on Auburn, because not only is Prince Tega Wanogo a guy who's going to be drafted in the first 3-4 rounds. You also have Jack Driscoll, the right tackle, 6'5", 296 pounds, very polished. I think he offers more athleticism than I was expecting. A guy who moves pretty well laterally. So he's somebody who I think is, Auburn with 2 tackles, Alabama with 2 tackles. Those are really my guys in my top 10. I've got Liam Eichenberg out of Notre Dame, 6'6", 305. He's a guy who struggles with some speed at times, but he could potentially be a swing tackle at the next level. Ezra Cleveland out of Boise State. He's kind of an undersized guy to some degree, and he's very athletic, very nimble, and a guy who just that lateral agility is absolutely there, but he lacks the power. There's virtually no power, no real punch in his game, doesn't really drive guys off the football. He's going to have to get stronger before he's going to be able to really make an impact. And then finally, Josh Jones out of Houston, 6'7", 310 pounds. Very easy mover in the passing game, but he's another guy who I think struggles as a run blocker. Doesn't really sustain his blocks. I think he relies on his athleticism a little too much, and I think because of that lack of polish, he's going to see himself kind of slide a little bit in the draft. So that's the offensive tackle position. We're going to take a look at the offensive guards now. Tennessee's Trey Smith, 6'6", 325 pounds. The junior, if you'll remember, dealing with blood clots. He's been cleared to play, and he looked like a guard when he was playing left tackle, and now that he's kicked into left guard, you really see his ability to explode off the ball and use that power. Really generates a lot of movement, pretty good knee bender as well, offers some versatility to play outside at the offensive tackle position in a pinch, but I think his home is going to be at guard, and I can see him being a day 2 pick. Tommy Kraemer out of Notre Dame, unfortunately was injured, out for the year, 6'6", 316 pounds. Alex Bars of Notre Dame was another guy that was being talked about last year as a potential high draft pick, and then due to injury, didn't really pick up much steam in the draft. So when you look at Tommy Kraemer, he's a junior. There is a good chance that he could come back for one more year. I'd like to see him do that because, honestly, you look at last year's draft, only 12 guards were taken. So, unless there's a guarantee that he's going to end up being a guy that's coming off the board day 2, I think, get healthy, come back to Notre Dame one more year, and then, show that you're fully recovered and be able to improve your draft stock. Now, one of the guys that everyone's talking about is Netane Muti, and out of Fresno State. He's 6'3", 307, the junior, just is a mauler. I mean, he reminds you a little bit of Quentin Nelson. He's got some nastiness to his game. Played in just 3 games this year, and ultimately went down with a Liz Frank foot injury. You'll remember that was an injury that slowed Marquise Brown up a little bit there as he was coming out of OU. Offensive lineman that's going to put a little bit more stress there on the foot, but durability has to be a concern for him. And he's somebody who, yes, he's emerged, as a standout redshirt freshman in 2017, but ruptured his Achilles in 2018. I know what that's like because I did that. I'm coming up on 1 year since I tore my Achilles, and that's not the easiest injury to come back from. So he did that, ended the 2018 season in the second game against Minnesota, missed his true freshman season in 2016 with a similar injury. So, you're looking at a guy, is he going to enter the draft after his junior year with all the injuries that he had? Had he stayed healthy this year, he may have decided, I'm going to go ahead and put my name into the draft. But after getting injured yet again, I just don't see that being a smart play for him right now, because right now the injuries are a huge red flag. So I really don't see, had he stayed healthy, he probably would have been in the top three of the offensive guards. But I think that's a huge blow to the draft. I still have him penciled in as my number 9 guard, even with all the injury issues. But I'd be surprised if he enters the draft at this point. Ben Bredeson of Michigan, Shane Lemieux of Oregon, a couple of veteran offensive tackles. Bredeson 6'5", 325, excellent puller. If you watch Michigan the last few weeks, you'll see Ben Bredeson getting out there in space. And the thing that I like is he's not just a guy who's going to get out there and pull and just get in the way. He's going to pull around, under control, locate the linebacker, get a kick out block or a good seal block, pretty good hips to get his hips around and seal off his man. So I do like Ben Bredeson there in the 3 or 4 range there at the offensive guard position. Shane Lemieux, over 40 starts to his career, 6'4", 317 pounds. He struggles a little bit with speed. I think he's a little heavy footed at times, but he's a veteran, does an excellent job. There was a good seal that he had on a USC offensive lineman that opened up a huge hole for CJ Verdell. And there was another run where, again, seal block opening a hole for Travis Dye. And that stable of running backs there for the Oregon Ducks. I think when you talk about offensive linemen, especially at the offensive guard position, the experience, obviously, Chris Lindstrom ended up going 14 overall. Michael Dieter of Wisconsin went number 78 overall. Some of these guys who have that experience. Hjalte Froholt was a 4th rounder. Wes Martin of Indiana, Phil Haynes of Wake Forest. Those were guys were also taken in round number 4. Michael Jordan was a 3-year starter at Ohio State. He was taken in round number 4 as well. So when you're looking at these guys, having that experience, that is going to go a long way. And I think that's what's going to get him drafted. Probably early day 3 would be my guess. Mekhi Becton out of Louisville. He's a left tackle for the Cardinal, and I'm sorry, the Cardinals. Stanford is the Cardinal. He's only a junior, 6'5", 368 pounds. He's a mammoth man. I worry about him and speed laterally. Is he going to be able to handle the speed rushers coming off the edge? I think he could be a very punishing guard and would be a lot of fun to watch. But look, I was expecting Marcus Cannon to move inside to guard, and he's made a living at right tackle. So Becton, I think guard is probably going to be his home. But I think he's a top 5 guard when we're talking about that. Parker Braun out of Texas, 6'3", 295 pounds, the grad transfer from Georgia Tech. And this is a guy who does a really good job on the move. He's a physical guy, looks to bury you, looks to maul you a little bit. And I think that's indicative of, what Paul Johnson was looking for out of his offensive lineman. And then Robert Hunt out of Louisiana Lafayette, 6'5", 322 pounds. He plays offensive tackle, but he's a mean, nasty dude. And I think if you put him inside a guard, that's what people are looking for. Guys that are going to be able to get out there and pull. You need guys that are going to be in the middle to deal with those interior pass rushers. And I'd love to see, Robert Hunt, at the Senior Bowl and at the Combine. He's somebody who I think can move up draft boards, and really start making a name for himself. I got Solomon Kinley sitting there at number 8, 6'4", 335 pounds, only a junior, could come back for one more year there between the hedges there in Athens for the Bulldogs. But he and Andrew Thomas work so well together. He's really physical, can be another mauler on the inside, a guy who generates a lot of movement. He and Thomas just caving in the left side of that offensive line, really opening up some holes for DeAndre Swift, Brian Herrien and company. I just don't know if he's going to decide to enter the draft or not. He is sharing time right now with Ben Cleveland. So that is a question mark. Why, if he's going to be someone who's going to enter the draft, why are we sharing time with another guard? That'd be something that scouts would definitely need to get to the bottom of. Kentucky's Logan Stenberg, 6'6", 332 pounds, a veteran. He and John Simpson will round out my, at number 10. John Simpson, 6'4", 330 pounds. A couple of guys who, are physical. I think they have good pop in their hands, generate some movement, veterans up front at the offensive guard position, and so I've got them kind of rounding out that guard spot, which then leads us to our centers. And obviously, Tyler Biadasz out of Wisconsin, 3-year starter there, 6'3", 321-pound junior, was a freshman All-American, a guy who could very well end up being a Remington Award winner. So athletic. He does a really good job getting out and pulling. He's not quite on the level of Garrett Bradbury when you're talking about, Bradbury was known as the grim reacher with all of his reach blocks. Not quite on that level, but a guy who can definitely generate some movement in the running game and pretty light on his feet in pass protection as well. Creed Humphrey, he's 6'5", 315 pounds there for Oklahoma. The only returner from the Joe Moore Trophy Award-winning offensive line. And really that offensive line took off when he was inserted into the starting lineup as a redshirt freshman. Now in his redshirt sophomore year, he's the true leader of that offensive line, the only guy to return. And you see the wrestling background, you see the balance, you see his ability to generate movement, the so quick off the ball and able to deal with pass rushers, the quickness there. He's somebody to keep an eye on should he decide to enter the draft. Darrell Williams from Mississippi State, 6'2", 310 pounds, not the biggest guy, but he has the versatility. He's played at the guard position, now inside at center. He's the veteran there for the Bulldogs, athletic, intelligent. Lloyd Cushenberry III out of LSU, 6'4", 315-pound junior. Another guy who's really athletic. He's been a starter there. He's a veteran at LSU. I have him and Matt Hennessy as my number 4 and 5 centers. Hennessy, 6'4", 295 pounds for Temple, battling some injuries now. And those are two guys who I think could potentially come back for their senior season. When you're talking about the center position, we only have 5 centers taking a season ago. When you look at the names, Garrett Bradbury, Elgton Jenkins, Eric McCoy, Lamont Gilliard, and Javon Patterson. When you talk about those guys, those are all veteran centers. Not too many guys, when you look at, or you're talking about juniors. And really, when you look at the 2018 draft, you have Frank Ragnow, Billy Price, taken at the top there. James Daniels came out a year early there out of Iowa, and he fell actually to round number 2 there for the Bears. And it's one of those things, I think the center position, how many centers are we really going to have taken in this year's draft? I'm looking at really the top 8, 9 guys could potentially be taken if all of the junior, redshirt sophomore and the juniors all come out. Nick Harris out of Washington, 6'1", 302. Another guy who's not the biggest guy in the world, but plays with excellent leverage. That snap off the ball, gets those hands underneath the pad level, does a really good job standing up defensive tackles because of that leverage, and that's really what he uses to his advantage. Jake Hansen, Oregon, you could see when he went down to injury, that offensive line wasn't quite as effective. This was the guy who really makes all the calls there up front. 6'5", 97 pounds. Hasn't given up a sack in his career. Over 40 starts to his credit as well. Very intelligent player, and just a guy who doesn't make a ton of mistakes. He's not the most athletic guy and can get beaten with speed and quickness off the ball, but just really a heady player. Zach Shackelford out of Texas, 6'4", 305. Needs to work on his pad level a little bit. I think he's been driven back into backfields. I think he's somebody who has the talent and the athleticism to play at the next level, but he's going to have to work on pad level, needs to really work on anchoring a little bit better. and generating some movement in the running game. Cole Cabral out of Arizona State, 6'5", 291 pounds. He hasn't given up a sack in his career. He's somebody who I think could potentially, especially if some of these juniors decide to come back, somebody who could potentially move up some draft boards. So those are my centers, guys that I'm going to be kind of keeping an eye on as we move through the rest of the college football season and into the pre-draft process. So we're going to transition from my offensive line and tight end picks to really what I saw last week, the games that I watched. And if you haven't listened to my podcast, I tune in, watch about 10 to 15 games each and every week. My goal is to ultimately watch at least one game for all 130 FBS programs. I'm over 100, making good progress. Hopefully before long I'll be hitting that 130 mark. The season's nearing completion, so I'm hoping before the end of the year I can go ahead and get some of that done. But let's see, what else did I get to watch? I'm flipping through my notes here. Wake Forest taking on NC State. Jamie Newman, we talked about him. He injured his shoulder, missed the game, but the athleticism, the ball placement, anticipation, I think he's somebody who very accurate in the pocket as well. Somebody who I think could potentially be in consideration as a first rounder next season. Boogie Basham, Carlos Basham Jr., 6'5", 275-pound redshirt junior. Number 9 for the Demon Deacons is a guy that you really need to keep an eye on. He's somebody who he's physical, can drive his man back into the backfield with a good bull rush. Also very quick off the ball. Has a really quick arm over off the snap to beat the left tackle. Very athletic and a guy who's continuing to rise up draft boards. Sage Surratt, wide receiver, 6'5", 215-pound redshirt sophomore. Very, very strong. I think that's one of the things that you see. Caught a slant, 7-yard gain, really corner on his back, really was dragging him for an extra 4 yards on this play. 54 receptions, with his first catch in the first quarter. That's second in the FBS at that point. Very excellent job to really adjust to the ball in midair. Really good on back shoulder throws as well. Uses his body to his advantage. Knows how to box out defensive backs. He's somebody who I think his stock is continuing to rise, and I think somebody who could potentially enter the draft. But I think if he comes back because of the depth of this wide receiver draft class, I'd love to see him come back. He could be in consideration as potentially the top wideout in next year's draft. Isang Bassi, 5'10", 190-pound corner, very physical. I think that's one of the things that you see. He had a big hit on the ball carrier, really drives quickly on the ball in coverage. Amari Henderson, 6'1", 180-pound senior. He was making plays all over the place, had a couple of picks. Does a good job attacking the receiver's arms, and really playing through. So excellent ball skills there. There was a post route, played way over the top. Really a poor quarterback throw, and that's one of the things that you saw. There was a redshirt freshman there for NC State, Devin Leary throwing the football, and Amari Henderson took advantage of that. Really got over the top of the route, and quarterback really kind of threw it to Henderson, making a play on the ball. But he's somebody who I think teams are going to continue to study and continue to go back to the game film, because he's somebody who I think is starting to turn some heads. Isang Bassi, because of all the pass breakups in his career, over 30 in his career, he's the guy that's making all the noise. But Amari Henderson, playing opposite him, 6'1", has good size, excellent length. He might be a guy that could end up sliding up some of the draft boards a little bit further. Michigan taking on Maryland, 38-7 was the final. Kwity Paye showing a tremendous job setting the edge against the run. 6'4", 277-pound junior. Be interesting to see if he decides to enter the draft. Aiden Hutchinson, remember that name for next year's draft. 6'6", 278 pounds. He was beating left tackles off the snap. and getting a good push to the quarterback, able to pursue the running back, from the backside. He'd start outside on the left tackle, then a spin move back to the inside to get to the quarterback as well. He's a guy that is really a lot of fun to watch. For Maryland, Keandre Jones, 6'3", 220-pound senior. This is a guy, he was a transfer from Ohio State. 10.5 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks on the year. Very active linebacker. He's one of those new age linebackers, a guy who's never going to come off the field. He's somebody who I think nobody's really talking about and could be a day 3 pick and end up finding himself on a roster because he is versatile. He can play the run, he can drop into coverage a little bit, and he can get after the quarterback. A name that people aren't talking about, Keandre Jones, number 4 for the Maryland Terrapins. Donovan Peoples-Jones, I think, everyone really knows what you're getting there. An athletic 6'2", 208-pound junior receiver. I'll be interested to see what the Michigan receivers do. You have Peoples-Jones, you have Nico Collins, who's the big physical 6'4", 220-pound junior. He's a deep ball threat, a guy who can elevate over the corner and pluck the football out of the air. Right now, he and Peoples-Jones have kind of separated themselves in that draft class for Michigan right now. But they're both juniors. Could decide to come back for one more season. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. I thought John Runyon had a good game, 6'5", 321-pound left tackle, really mauling the defensive end at the point of attack throughout the game. Doesn't really panic on a lot of the secondary moves either. He does struggle with speed. I truly believe John Runyon, he could play tackle at the next level, but I truly believe if he were to play inside at guard, I think that's really where his home is going to be. I got to watch Buffalo take on Eastern Michigan, 43-14 win for the Bulls. And Buffalo, their running backs, Kevin Marks and Jared Patterson, if you haven't gotten to watch them play, I think you'd be in for a treat. Jared Patterson, 5'9", 195 pounds. The sophomore, already over 800 yards and 5 touchdowns. Really good feet between the tackles, vision to see the cutback lanes, has really good speed to the outside. 4 100-yard games so far this season, and a guy who just continues to get better as the game goes forward, runs behind his pads, really good forward lean to him. He's going to be someone that you're going to have to keep an eye on next season. Notre Dame, number 16, Irish, taking down the Hokies 21-20. Ian Book, yes, he had some late game heroics, and he had developed really good chemistry there with Chase Claypool, hitting him down the sideline. But I thought there were a lot of missed throws, a lot of missed opportunities, and that's one of those things that's going to be of concern. I look at Trace McSorley, though, a smaller quarterback, Ian Book, 6 foot, 212 pounds, and I beat up Trace McSorley because of his the athleticism. But look, Ian Book is another gritty guy, and McSorley wound up finding his way onto an NFL roster. I wouldn't be surprised if Ian Book, that grittiness, he led his team down for the game-winning drive with 2 minutes 30 seconds to play. Ultimately, got the rushing touchdown to win it. He struggles with his completion percentage. He's only at 59.2 on the year, but I wouldn't be surprised if Ian Book still ends up making a roster because of that moxie. But he's got to cut down on the mistakes, all the interceptions. That's something that just can't happen. I look at Chase Claypool. He's 6'4", 229 pounds. He's not as explosive as Miles Boykin was coming out of Notre Dame. But what Claypool really has is he has that size. He attacks the football in the air. And I think of Darren Waller coming out of Georgia Tech. He was a big physical wideout with some good speed there at Georgia Tech. And he's converted into that new age tight end. And I think Chase Claypool as a receiver, I think the ceiling is a little bit more limited than if he were to move to the tight end position. I think that he has the body and the frame for that. We mentioned Cole Kmet earlier. He was running away from Reggie Floyd on a corner route. Ball was overthrown, but he was separating from the safety. I have notes here. Good inline blocker, really good hands, excellent feet as a blocker as well. Let's see. Good burst up the seam on an 8-yard touchdown. Excellent down block on the linebacker. Dax Holyfield really set the edge for Book on a run to the perimeter. He's somebody, like I said, I think is continuing to improve his draft stock. Khalid Kareem showing some power, rushing the passer. Showed a little bit of speed as well. Excellent hands getting into the chest of the left tackle, then ripping through to get to free himself off the block, and then planning and turning the corner. Does a good job pursuing down the line against the run as well. Julian Okwara in that game, somewhat quiet. 2 tackles, a tackle for loss, a quarterback hurry, but really hasn't made a ton of plays the last couple of weeks. And you really, he really started off the season well, started off strong, and waiting for Julian Okwara to really assert himself yet again. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there going forward. Now, Utah, 33-28 winners over Washington. And I've already talked about what happened with Jacob Eason, also talked about Trey Adams. Bradley Anae, this is a guy who just continues to fight off the edge. Was fighting through Adams' blocks all day long, trying to really attack that outside shoulder, dipping through and fighting through the blocks, using his hands to get the edge. Excellent job keeping his balance on a cut block. And really, when he ultimately got to the quarterback, what happened was he got Trey Adams to square his shoulders to the sideline, and that's really what did him in. He was attacking that outside shoulder. Ultimately, Adams squared himself to the sideline and couldn't recover, and got his 25th sack on the year. Bradley and I can play both, as a stand-up rush end and with his hand in the ground. 6'3", 265 pounds. We'll be talking about him as we talk about the edge rushers in the coming weeks. But he's somebody that I look at Utah, and he's one of their better defenders, and a guy who should be a day 2 pick. As is Leki Fotu, 6'5", 335 pounds, really holds his ground at the point of attack against double teams. Very active hands and pass protection. A guy who he's just a space eater. He's going to take up a ton of space. He's athletic. He can collapse the pocket and pass. Against the pass, and he's probably going to end up being a day 2 guy. Probably not going to see his way into round number 1, but a very physical guy, and a guy who can win at the point of attack, free up linebackers like Francis Bernard, let's say, who's 6'1", 235 pounds, number 13, running around with the flowing locks out of his helmet. Excellent range. A guy who can play sideline to sideline, run into the boundary, able to beat the center's block. Got to the perimeter, able to drop him for a tackle for loss. Really got inside that center, and was able to drop the running back before he could really get ahead of steam. Francis Bernard, kind of an underrated outside linebacker. Zach Moss, we've already talked about him. Utah's all-time leading rusher. My notes indicate, very powerful, powerful legs, very thick legs, runs hard between the tackles, breaks a lot of tackles, presses a line of scrimmage, good lateral cut to bounce it outside, really quick feet, making jump cuts. And I think that's one of the things that it just continues to say over and over is the jump cuts, has the burst, the ability to stop and start, excellent vision to find the holes. He was a guy who was very, very pivotal in Utah getting the win over the Huskies. Let's see. What else do we have as we scroll through my notes? TCU taking on Oklahoma State. 34-27 winners were the Pokes. And they were without Tylan Wallace, the Biletnikoff Award finalist a season ago. And they showed a highlight. I hadn't actually gotten to see it yet. but holy cow, against Iowa State, the quick throw out onto the perimeter, makes the catch, and ends up lowering his shoulder and running over a really good safety in Greg Eisworth. Ran him over, takes off down the sideline, ultimately gets a stiff arm on another defensive back. Explosive play for a touchdown. He's out for the year though with a torn ACL, so his draft stock really, in question right now. I thought he was a guy who wasn't the most explosive, but a guy who I thought was really a sudden route runner, and that suddenness. That's something he's going to have to prove that knee is healthy. Jalen Reagor, there's no doubt that he is explosive. 5'11", 195 pounds. He's still in my top 10 at the receivers, even though he struggles to catch the ball in traffic. Explosive, explosive, explosive. I just have that written all over my notes here. Had a quick screen on the perimeter, really dove to the outside and followed a block, really accelerates down the field, stutter and go to the outside, beat the corner, able to go up and high point the football for 36 yards, ended up landing on his lower back and kind of had to head to the locker room early ahead of halftime, but definitely explosive. Talked about Tylan Wallace going out. TCU's offensive tackle, Lucas Niang, 6'7", 328 pounds. He's also out for the year. That's why he really wasn't mentioned in the offensive tackle rankings. Jeff Gladney, the corner for TCU, 6 foot, 183 pounds, really showing that he can turn and run with the receiver. Out of bail technique, got his hands on the receiver, ended up getting over the top of the route, and kind of pinched the receiver into the sideline. Really took away any chance at the receiver making the catch. Ross Blacklock, 6'4", 305 junior defensive tackle. He's a very intriguing prospect. Has good quickness off the football, split a double team, got a push up front to get to the running back for a tackle for loss, looped around to the outside from the defensive tackle position, gets back up the field to end up dropping the quarterback who was stepping up into the pocket. I think he was really trying to flee the pocket, Spencer Sanders, so that would make sense. Holds the point well, does a good job keeping his arm free to end up wrapping up the running back in the running game. And then obviously Chuba Hubbard, 172.6 rushing yards per game, over 1,300 yards entering this game. Tremendous burst, really hitting the hole in a hurry between the tackles. Very patient, though, to let the holes develop. Quarterback, run to the perimeter, whiffed on a block. And that's really where he's struggling, I think, a little bit is that pass protection. Okay hands out of the backfield, but I think the passing game is really new to Chuba, and really when you can bust off a 92-yard touchdown run, I mean the hole just opened up for him and let him go. I mean when you can do stuff like that, you can potentially be a special back, really accelerated away from the defensive backs. He has sprinter speed. Had a stiff arm on Garrett Wallow as he was getting to the edge on another run. 62-yard touchdown, exploded through another hole. Just give him a crease and he was gone. I remember talking about Darrell Henderson and the speed and his ability to get north and south in a hurry. Chuba Hubbard absolutely does that, and he, nobody's been able to really stop him this year. He's somebody who I think with all the momentum that he has, he could very well decide that he's going to come out after the redshirt sophomore year. But with Spencer Sanders sitting there at the quarterback position, the prospect of possibly having Tylan Wallace come back, there's a good chance that Chuba Hubbard could very well decide that he's going to come back for one more year. That would really be interesting. Miami taking on Florida State, 27-10 winners. The Hurricanes over the Seminoles. Shaq Quarterman had a huge day. Ultimately, 9 tackles, 3.5 tackles for loss. Shows really good speed to the perimeter. Excellent downhill as a thumper, much like Denzel Perryman. He's the veteran. He's a guy who's played in every game and started every game in his Hurricane career. Number 55, all over the field. The biggest thing for him is dropping into coverage. And I think that's something where he needs to continue to develop. I think he gets lost at times. And that's really what could potentially hinder his draft stock. But he's absolutely a top 10 inside backer and is deserving of being drafted early on day 3. Gregory Rousseau, if you haven't seen this redshirt freshman, holy cow, 6'6", 260 pounds, had 3 sacks a week before, the week prior, and then against Florida State, just absolute beast. 8 tackles, 4 sacks, 5 total tackles for loss. He's got tremendous length, but the burst off the football, they like to line him up at defensive tackle and rush the quarterback from the inside. I mean, he just really embarrassed Cole Minshew, the right guard. Really just took off, ran by him, and got to the quarterback, really dropping Alex Hornibrook before he really had a chance to do anything with the football. Cam Akers is a top 10 running back in this year's draft, 5'11", 212 pounds, very powerful. I think you see that, the powerful, stiff arms, strength to run through tackles as well. Let's see, the week before against Syracuse, 20 carries, 144 yards, and 4 touchdowns, with tied a school record. They put that stat up. Greg Allen, Anton Smith, and Dalvin Cook also with 4 touchdowns in their career. In one game. The acceleration and the speed downhill, but he has some good lateral ability as well. Very physical in the hole. With Shaq Quarterman, was really difficult to bring down. Showed some elusiveness with some lateral cuts, and then a spin move as well. He's not as, I think there's a little bit of stiffness in his hips, more of a one cut and go type of a guy, but very powerful, good speed, and a guy who could potentially be a day 2 pick. Janarius Robinson, big number 11, 6'5", 261 pounds. I could see him potentially entering the draft. Very quick off the ball, very natural pass rusher, dips his inside shoulder, but a guy who just struggled to get off blocks. That was one of the things that really jumped out to me. The right tackle, DJ Scaife Jr., that was really his biggest thing. He's going to have to add a little bit more strength to his game before I think he's ready to come out and really make a difference. Marvin Wilson, the defensive tackle, 6'5", 312 pounds, really shows a good burst off the ball, was double teamed, was able to spin back inside to free himself up and get after the quarterback. But he's having hand surgery, out for the year. So could he have played his last game in a Florida State Seminole uniform? That remains to be seen. And then a safety who, if he enters the draft, is going to be a top 5 safety, and that's Hamza Nasruddin, 6'4", 215 pounds, shows tremendous range. There's a swing pass to the running back, came downhill in a hurry to the perimeter to drop the running back in space, played underneath in coverage, read the quarterback's eyes, really allowed it to take him to the ball, got his hands on the football to force a 4th down play, speed off the edge, as a blitzer, direct path to the quarterback, hits him as he throws. And I just note excellent length, excellent range, blitzing the quarterback, gets his hand up in a passing lane to deflect a pass. He's a guy who may not quite be on the level of Grant Delpit or Xavier McKinney, but if you're looking for a safety a little bit later on in the draft, he's got that size. He could potentially develop into a linebacker. You look at him, and he reminds me a lot of really Isaiah Simmons. He's somebody who I think can continue to improve his draft stock. SMU ultimately got beat by Memphis 54-48 at the Liberty Bowl. And James Prochet, 13 receptions, 149 yards, and a touchdown. Not the fastest guy in the world, but he's sudden. He's sudden with his movements, does a really good job uncovering himself. And I think that's one of the things that I want to see at the Senior Bowl. Cooper Kupp really emerged as a guy that nobody could cover. And Terry McLaurin got to do that a little bit himself. And you got to see him showcase an ability to separate. Now, when you talk about a guy like Cooper Kupp, this is kind of the depth of the wide receiver position in this year's draft. Cooper Kupp was drafted in round number 3. And that was in the 2017 draft. Now, you had the 3 wide receivers, Corey Davis, Mike Williams, John Ross, all taken in round number 1. Zay Jones Curtis Samuel, Juju Smith-Schuster all taken in round number 2, and then Cooper Kupp was the 5th pick in round number 3. I'd like to think that James Prochet is a 3rd-round value. I mean, that's ultimately where Terry McLaurin went as well. James Prochet could end up coming off the board in round 4 or 5 just because of the depth, but he's the guy who I think could end up making an impact and being a guy who could be a starter in the league. But just because of this draft class, he could very well fall down, a little bit. His draft stock could drop a little. Memphis, man, they've got a fabulous freshman at the running back position in Kenneth Gainwell. 21 carries, 88 yards on the year. Gainwell is 5'11", 191 pounds, and a guy who just has such strong legs. There's a 14-yard touchdown as well. Really followed the defensive tackle Joseph Dorsey is playing fullback off the edge. Really good stiff arm, and ultimately able to get to the edge and score the touchdown. Physical, strong, and an excellent burst. DeMonte Coxey, 7 receptions, 143 yards, 2 touchdowns on the game, and 6'3", 197 pounds. A track athlete, a guy who tore his ACL in high school, and has really turned into a tremendous receiving option there on the outside for Brady White. 28 straight games with a reception. Let's see if I can read my note here. Stutter got an outside release, beat the jam of the wideout, got by the corner, had a step on him. Brady White puts it right over over the shoulder, extends that left hand and left arm, and really gets a one-handed catch down the football field for a 25-yard gain. He definitely looks the part, but with this draft class, I think he's a guy who should probably come back for his senior season, play with Brady White one more year, have a breakout season, really separate yourself and become one of those guys that you're talking about as a potential 1st-round pick. I think because of this, he's one of those guys who could potentially get lost in the shuffle. A senior, Antonio Gibson, 6 receptions, 130 pounds and a touchdown. 130 yards and a touchdown. Also had 3 carries for 97 yards and a score, and returned the ball, a kickoff, 97 yards for a touchdown. So a kick, a rush, and a reception, all for TD in that game. Very explosive athlete, 6'2", 221 pounds, has some good size to him as well. He'll be somebody that people are going to start talking about more and more. And then TJ Carter, the corner, 8 tackles, a tackle for loss, 2 pass breakups, excellent ball skills. He's a guy that nobody's really talking about at the cornerback position, 5'11", 189-pound junior. He's a guy who's a 3-year starter for the Memphis Tigers. I'd love to see him come back one more year and really solidify himself as one of the top corners in all of college football. And then the Oregon game, USC against Oregon, 56-24 final. Justin Herbert, I think, showed an ability to, he struggled in the first quarter, really finding any type of a rhythm. But once he got going, he started hitting his receivers, finding Jawan Johnson, he's finally healthy, the grad transfer from Penn State, 6'4", 230 pounds. He's really physical on the outside, some pretty good speed as well, to his credit. Not afraid to go over the middle. He struggled with some drops at Penn State. But I think he has developed some chemistry with Justin Herbert. So down the stretch, I think that's something that you're going to definitely see. Talked about Michael Pittman. Let's see. Separates, a little bit on an out route, attack the football in the air, body control along the sideline, quick throw. That was really what USC was trying to do to get him the football, because a lot of times he had 3 defenders on him. But catch and a burst up the field on a tunnel screen, kept his balance, kept his legs turning. He's a difficult guy to bring down once he has the ball in his hand. Very physical blocker on the outside. Had a 13-yard touchdown. Let's see, an in cut. Let's see. In cut inside the corner, catch for a touchdown before the safety could get over. he's just a guy who just continues to make plays, and a guy who's just going to continue to see his draft stock continue to rise. Outside shot at the first round. I think he'll be an early second round pick when it's all said and done. But Oregon just dominated. Really USC, some poor clock management there at the end of the game, or end of the first half, kicking the football deep, and ultimately a kickoff return for touchdown. Went from a 4-point game to an 11-point game. USC unable to stop Oregon coming out after half, and the route was on. Troy Dye playing with a club on his hand, and I think it was a thumb injury, if I want to say, but 6'4", 226 pounds. He's Oregon's 3-time leading tackler, and he was someone that even with playing with that club was all over the field. He was making hits on the quarterback to really force early throws, wrapping up guys in the open field. He's someone who's just a good athlete, a guy who's not going to no need to come off the field on third down. He's a 3-down linebacker. He'll be a day 3 guy, but a guy who I think is going to end up finding himself a home, and a guy who I think is going to play for a long time. So those were the games that I got to watch, and I've got some games that I'll be tuning into here in week 11 for sure. So if we go ahead and take a look at these matchups before we go ahead and call it a podcast, let's see. Obviously, Saturday, the big game, the early game is going to be Penn State against Minnesota. 2 undefeated teams. Penn State, you're going to have Sean Clifford at quarterback, KJ Hamler at receiver, but Antoine Winfield at Minnesota, he's a junior. His dad played in the league for a number of years, a ball hawk at the safety position. You'll have Carter Coughlin at the defensive end position coming off the edge. Kamal Martin, if he's healthy, there at linebacker. Very athletic player as well. Penn State, though, that defense, they're going to be, can they stop Rodney Smith, the running back? They're very physical up front. Sam Schluter is a pretty decent junior left tackle, underrated in terms of his athleticism, and has pretty good hands, will strike you a little bit. And then the big 6'9", 400-pound right tackle, Daniel Faalele. It'll be fun to watch those two guys go up against the likes of Shaka Tony and Yetur Gross-Matos. You're going to have Micah Parsons playing sideline to sideline. It's going to be a fun game to watch. I anticipate James Franklin's group to beat PJ Fleck, but I think it's going to be a lot closer than people think. Let's see, Vanderbilt, 2-6 on the year, heading to the Swamp to take on Florida. That offense struggling a little bit with getting anything really going. So I anticipate Florida to have a field day there. Baylor taking on TCU. Baylor's undefeated. Expect Charlie Brewer, Denzel Mims, and company to end up winning that football game. I feel bad for East Carolina going up against SMU after their first loss of the season. I expect James Prochet, Shane Buechele, that connection to really give the Pirates fits early and often. As we scroll through Florida State, if they want to make a bowl game, even with Willie Taggart being fired, they're 4-5 on the year. It's going to get started with Boston College 5-4. AJ Dillon showing what he can do when he's finally healthy. He's big, he's physical, he's 6 foot, 245 pounds. Doesn't really catch the football out of the backfield, which is a concern. But he's a guy who can run over you and he can run by you. They say he can run a 4.5 40, battled the high ankle sprain for much of the year a season ago. I haven't gotten to watch Boston College play yet this year, but I really want to watch him play because he's a guy who's just going to continue to get better and wear teams down as the game goes along, and we'll be able to really see what Florida State has in terms of can they bear down and really. They're going to have to stop him in order to win that football game. I just don't know that they're going to be able to do that. So the afternoon game of the hour, LSU against Alabama, number 2 versus number 3, going into Tuscaloosa, Bryant-Denny Stadium. Tua Tagovailoa versus Joe Burrow. Najee Harris, the running back, against Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I bet you Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going to have, really, I think if he has a big game, LSU is going to end up coming out on top. If he's rushing for over 100 yards, that means that Alabama and that defense is struggling to stop the run, which is also going to open up some play action passes for Joe Burrow. And you can say what you want about Alabama's receivers. LSU has themselves some pretty good receivers as well. And, it's two guys who just do a tremendous job with the slant routes, the anticipation, the ability to throw their receivers open, hit them in stride, allow them to get up the field. And, they'll pick their Tua and Joe Burrow aren't guys who are going to be chucking the ball deep left and right. They're going to pick their throws, pick their shots. And when they do that, the ball placement is absolutely there. They both throw with anticipation. It's going to be a fun quarterback duel. Offensive line, I think Alabama definitely has the edge there. And with Michael Divinity no longer on the LSU roster, you're not going to see much of a pass rush. I think with Alabama, you've got Terrell Lewis, you've got Anthony Jennings rushing the quarterback. You also have Raekwon Davis up front. And then in the secondary, Trevin Diggs and Xavier McKinney really leading that secondary. LSU with Christian Fulton and Grant Delpit. I worry about Tua picking them apart if they can't get pressure on the quarterback. I think Alabama ends up winning the game. It's going to be a close one, but like I said, if they let Clyde Edwards-Helaire run the football, then they're going to basically continue to wear down that Bama defense. Time of possession, a lot of times an offense is a really good defense. So if Alabama lets that running game really take over, then you could end up seeing LSU end up squeaking out the win. K-State, and Chris Kleiman's team, they're ranked number 16 in the country, taking on Texas. This is going to be a pivotal matchup. Who's going to end up being in the Big 12 championship? That's going to be a big game. Let's see, who else do we have? USC. They've named a new athletic director, Mike Bond, coming from Cincinnati to USC. Clay Helton really on the hot seat, going up against Herman Edwards and Arizona State. I think USC is going to play. Have some inspired play there at Sun Devil Stadium. The game to watch. If you're not watching that SEC game, it's going to be a Big Ten battle. Iowa, number 18 in the country, taking on Wisconsin, ranked number 13 overall. I pair of 6-2 teams. Iowa with Nate Stanley. What is he going to be able to do against that Wisconsin defense that struggled a little bit, especially against Illinois, and also struggled against Ohio State. Zach Bond is going to need some help coming off the edge. See if Alaric Jackson can really deal with that speed coming off the edge. If he ends up going up against Tristan Wirfs, that'd be a fun matchup to watch. But I think if you get Zach Bond, that matchup against Alaric Jackson, I really like that more so for Wisconsin. And then Iowa, AJ Epinesa and company. Can AJ Epinesa get after Jack Cohn? That's going to be a big question mark. He's going to go up against Cole Van Lannon. Hasn't really been able to have a breakout game rushing the quarterback. Really want to see him get after the quarterback because there's a chance to be able to do that. And can Jonathan Taylor run against a stingy Iowa defense? I think Wisconsin ends up getting the ball to Jonathan Taylor, let him rush for 150 yards and a couple of scores, and they eke out the win there. Georgia taking on Missouri. Missouri 5-3 on the year. The number 6 Bulldogs at home against Mizzou. And I like the Bulldogs here. I think they're going to do just enough to end up getting the win against Mizzou. Let's see, what else do we have? Clemson taking on NC State. Notre Dame against Duke. Those they should have easy time there. Night game. Here's an intriguing matchup. Oklahoma, the 9th-ranked Sooners, coming off of a bye after a loss. Taking on Iowa State, who's 5-3 on the year. Matt Campbell's group. Brock Purdy at quarterback. it'll be interesting to see, OU and that offense going up against another defense that's, a tough, gritty defense like K-State's. Iowa State, led by Jaquan Bailey, the defensive end. Mike Rose is a sophomore linebacker to watch. Marcel Spears at linebacker. Obviously, Greg Eisworth. Yes, he got run over by Tylan Wallace, but he's a guy who makes plays all over the field. That's going to be interesting for sure. But I think the Sooners, Jalen Hurts, he's just been taking really a business-like approach to this entire season, and with the ball in his hands, it's hard to bet against him. So those will be the games that I'm keeping an eye out for. I think one sneaky good game is going to be Boise State against Wyoming. It's a late game. Let's see, 9:15 Central Standard Time. 7-1 Broncos at home on the blue turf against the Wyoming Cowboys. Cowboys coming in 6-2. Boise State 7-1. Hank Bachmeier, the freshman there for Boise State. It's going to be interesting to see who ends up winning that one. They'll be in the driver's seat there for the Mountain West Conference. So I think I'll see if I can get that game recorded and watch that. And one final game for you. It's going to be on ESPNU. 6:30 Central Standard Time game. Liberty taking on BYU. And the reason why I bring that up, Liberty Flames, if you haven't gotten to watch Antonio Gandy-Golden, tune in and watch him play. BYU with a tough, gritty defense. But, if Stephen Calvert is given any time, he and Gandy-Golden can really make some plays on the outside. Gandy-Golden, I don't have him in my top 10 wideouts, but he's definitely a guy who has tremendous length, a guy who can make plays down the football field, the guy who's going to be a red zone nightmare for teams because of that length. He's the guy who's going to be a top 12, top 13 wideout in this draft, and a guy that we're talking about, among the top in terms of receiving yards in the country. He's one of those guys that I think if he tests well, he's going to continue to see his draft stock rise. He'll probably end up falling into day 3, but a guy who I think has a high ceiling and a guy who's just continuing to develop and continuing to get better. I think Hugh Freeze coming in has definitely helped him out quite a bit. So hopefully everyone enjoys week 11 of the college football season. I know when we talk next week, we'll get to see a little bit more about that college football playoff ranking, what that all looks like. Who wins the Alabama-LSU game, who's going to win the Penn State-Minnesota game. Those are going to be some interesting conversations for sure. I'm going to enjoy some of those matchups. We're going to talk about edge rushers next week as well. Chase Young, we're going to spend some time talking about him and his game, but there are other guys that are out there as well. From Bradley and I, taking more of a look at him, to Curtis Weaver, to Terrell Lewis, more of a linebacker, but he's also an edge rusher. We'll talk about him. Julian Aquara as well. Yetur Gross-Matos. There are a lot of guys that can come off the edge and wreak some havoc. How about Alex Highsmith out of Charlotte? Have him penciled in as an outside linebacker, but a guy who can definitely get after the quarterback. So we're going to talk edge rushers. We're going to see where some of those guys shake out, and are there other pass rushers who will be joining Chase Young in the first round? There are a couple of guys that I have in mind, so we'll go ahead and stay tuned for the next podcast, and we'll talk all about it. So hope everyone enjoys their weekend, enjoys watching some college football, NFL on Sunday and Monday, and we'll go ahead and start this podcast all over again next week. So for ReadyForTheDraft.com, this has been Gregg Schutze, the Ready for the Draft podcast, signing off. Take care, everyone. I am out of here.